This is CSBS Nonbank Cybersecurity Examination Program Training Webinar. We're recording this training and we'll post the recording on our website with the program. My name is Chuck Cross. I'm the Senior Vice President of CSBS's Nonbank Supervision and Enforcement Section. With me today is Jessica Ruzick, who will be conducting most of this training, and Jessica will introduce herself and provide you her background after this introduction. In 2018, the CSBS Board of Directors asked the CSBS State Supervisory Processes Committee and the Non-Depository Supervisory Committee to develop a non-bank cybersecurity examination program. A work group comprised of both bank and non-bank IT and cyber exam experts was formed, and they held development sessions from September of 2018 through this last summer. I'd like to identify the work group members and formally thank them. Matthew Fujikawa from California, Bob Lipo from California, Spencer Staten from Illinois, Kevin Stouter from Indiana, Holly Chase from Massachusetts, Henry Hallman from North Carolina, Denise Sandy from Pennsylvania, Philip Hinkle from Texas, Crystal Flatten from Washington, Ahung Nguyen from Washington State. I'd also like to identify staff who were part of this initiative. Mary Beth Quist was my co-lead with this initiative, and Jessica Ruzick, who will be doing the training today, was an integral part of this development. Mike Bray from my team also provided facilitation and support to the work group. At the end of this training, we will have time for comments and questions. At that time, we'll ask that you state your name, your state, and your agency so that we can respond outside this webinar if necessary. I would also like to ask all of you to keep your phones on mute until a point in time which you want to raise a question or make a comment. That'll reduce the likelihood of any background noise or interference. So with that, I will turn this over to Jessica for the training. Jessica?
Hi everyone, my name is Jess Ruzick. I am the Cyber Policy SME at CSBS. I work for Todd Scharf, who is our Chief Information Security Officer, and I manage all of our cybersecurity policies, do some exam work, get loaned out for special projects, and it was an honor to be part of the non-bank exam program. And again, thank you to all of the work group members. It was a real team effort. Once again proved how strong the relationship between CSBS and the states is, and I appreciate all of your effort. So we had to decide, we'd like to put together this work program, but what does that mean? There are so many models out there. On what basis did we want to build this work program so that it would be useful to everyone? We assessed pretty much all the available cyber standards and exam programs that were already out there. We took a look at what Washington State is already doing for non-banks. We looked at CAT, INTREX, CIS Top 20, and NIST 853 Rev 4, which is a federal standard. And we ultimately concluded that all of those capabilities had a nice place within the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or the NIST CSF. The CSF is capability-based, which means that it's not as concerned with how you meet requirements, but that you are able to do so and that you can prove you do so. So the CSF neatly buckets cybersecurity activities into functions, and those functions are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So that means every aspect of an institution's cybersecurity program can be slotted into one of those 5 functions. It's really flexible. It allows for actual risk management and threat prioritization, because what one state regulatory agency prioritizes may be different than another, and what one entity prioritizes may be different than another. It is the closest we came to a living, breathing standard, and it allows for flexibility dependent on state resources, examiner experience, entity experience, threat prioritization, and a bunch of other factors that may differ based on the entity, the state, the year, so on and so forth. So we decided to go with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Then what we did is we mapped all of the other standards we considered to the cybersecurity framework to make sure that whatever other states were already using to regulate had a place within this new exam work program. We took a look and saw if any questions were missing, and then we added them in based on, if Washington State was already asking 3 questions that didn't have a neat place within the cybersecurity functions, we just created them and slotted them in where we thought was appropriate. So we mapped all those standards to the cybersecurity framework. Then we had to decide how we wanted to structure it. This program is only as good as it is useful to all of you, and we really structured things with that guiding principle in mind. So we sorted all of those questions into the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover functions, eliminated a lot of duplicates, consolidated where possible, and we then adjusted the stringency of the requirements. There are a lot of questions that originally ask, you know, do you have X type of firewall, or do you perform an audit every 1 year, 2 years, 6 months, whatever. And we wanted to leave it up to the state and also to the entity to guide what those frequencies should be. Again, the state helps set the standard, and then the entity meets it however possible, and that should not be for CSBS or one small group of examiners to determine. That needs to be a true risk-based decision that the boards of these institutions are making, that your governors are making, commissioners, and examiners. We ended up with 147 controls or exam questions. To date, there is no consensus on whether that's too many or too few. I'll leave it up to you. That's part of the feedback we'll be collecting. I, of course, am biased, but I think it is just right. It is a perfect number. And I'll get into some of those, and I'll walk you through a little bit so you can get a feel for the type of controls we thought were important enough to be included in this work program. One of the big changes we made that I haven't seen in any of the other work programs that are out there is we really wanted to kind of create a place to start a conversation between the regulated entities and the regulators. I think too often there are miscommunications that lead to misunderstandings, failed controls, lack of adequate information, when really it's just because the entities don't understand why they need to dedicate the time to an exam, and perhaps the regulators then get frustrated trying to explain it and say, well, I'm the expert, please rely on me, and there just leads to miscommunications that can create some unwanted tensions. So we added, and again, I'll walk you through this in a little bit, we added a column that essentially translates the cybersecurity requirements into normal people language. So that way, if you're having difficulty explaining to an entity why you need to ask them this question and why it's phrased this way and why it sounds similar to another question, it helps you explain to them why it is in fact important, why it's worthy of being asked on its own, separate from other questions, so on and so forth. So it's our hope that this translation column is really useful for communication with the entity employees. Again, I bring the cyber expertise, but I relied incredibly heavily on banking and non-bank examiners, other IT examiners, and so this translation column we hope will be useful and mitigate the effect of differing backgrounds within an exam. So I told you we had 147 controls. They're not all equally important, right? Certain things matter to us or to you more than they matter to someone else, to your peer, to the entity, someone doing the exact same exam a year from now. So we wanted to allow for the flexibility of prioritization. So what we did is we established core controls. Those are the core controls. They're mandatory for every exam. And if you include them in an exam and the entity does very well and can meet all of those requirements, it's assumed that they have a minimum level of acceptable cybersecurity. Again, I want to stress it's a minimum level of acceptable cybersecurity, but that's still a good level of cybersecurity. You'll see that the primary emphasis is on the identify and protect functions, and that's because that's how you prepare. That's how you develop your cybersecurity program. It's how you prepare for an incident. It's how you plan for how you'll respond when one happens. And about 74 out of those 147 controls we considered important enough to be mandatory core controls, so it splits about 50-50. The other 73 controls are ones that are non-core, which means the examiner really can decide to include them or not. We recommend it. It's encouraged, but it is in fact optional. And the examiner can decide based on their personal expertise. Previous exam results are a really useful way to determine if you need to assess the same control again, differing state priorities, and also current events. Say ransomware is, on a rampage through your state, perhaps you have slightly different non-core controls that you want to include in the exam. So that's how we're helping you prioritize the controls. And again, it's up to you based on your expertise and your state priorities. So at the end of this year-long work program process, what did we put together? A couple different things. So we have the pre-exam package consisting of the first day letter or the notification to the entity that they'll be examined, an IT officer's questionnaire, which is where you request information from the entity, and that could be the names and contact information of the entity POCs, their basic InfoSec information, their basic IT information, any data points that will help you scope those core and non-core controls. The answers should be provided in the IT officer's questionnaire. And then there's also a document request list, which I'll walk you through in just a moment. Then there's the work program itself. It's in Excel right now. It's sorted by NIST function, so by identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. There's also a duplication of the document request checklist so that everything is in one place for the examiner's convenience. A restatement of the questionnaire information, the answers, and you'll see that based on the answers, we make suggestions for which non-core controls you might want to consider including. And the work program is customizable within each worksheet. So as I mentioned, it's a basic Excel sheet, and you can sort by core controls, non-core controls, keywords, whatever's going to make your life easier. I do want to highlight we do not have a standardized report into which you can provide the inputs and the results of the exam. We considered it, but because this is a work program intended for all non-bank institutions, it was just exceedingly difficult to come up with one standard that would meet everyone's needs. We did debate it, we talked about it, we tried to make it work, and just to date, it wasn't feasible. We didn't think it would be a good use of everyone's time. It's something we'll revisit, though, if we start hearing feedback from all of you that that's something that's imperative that we look at. All right, so I'm going to switch screens really quickly and walk you through the IT exam, the IT officer's questionnaire, the document request list, and the exam work program itself. So just bear with me, please, while I switch my screen. Okay, so this is the IT officer's questionnaire, and you'll see it is pretty standard. There's some introductory, explaining why we have this, what it's useful for, how to fill it out, basic instructional information. And then as you scroll down, there are about 15 to 20 questions, I believe. And these are questions that you really need the answer to before you can begin an exam. So I always like to highlight question number 1. I consider it to be very important. And it is, does your organization have an employee with the designated responsibility for implementing the InfoSec program? Ideally, the answer should be yes, that there is always an individual with dedicated authority for the cybersecurity program. But I understand that's not always the case. So the entity can say, yes, we do have that person, and then in the response comments tab say, yes, their name is Jessica Bruzik, here's their contact information, and then that would help the examiner know who to talk to, who to follow up with. Or they say no, in which case you might have additional questions you want to ask, or to take a closer look at the actual security of the InfoSec program because they don't have someone regularly monitoring it, updating it, holding it accountable. There's other information requested too, like daily transaction volume. Again, anything we think will be useful to help the examiner scope the exam and decide which questions to ask. I do want to highlight on the document request list, which I will walk you through here. This is the version that's in the examination work program for the examiner. I think I've highlighted a little bit with that translation column I mentioned, that miscommunications are often the root of bad exam results or tensions between the examiner, the regulator, and the examined entity. A lot of this I found from my own experience conducting exams is that people call things by different names. So reference number 1 on the document request list under program area says if I'm an examiner, am asking an entity for their documented information security program. That could mean almost anything, and that's what we want because when you convey this to the examined entity, they should be able to provide you whatever they think fills that role. What we want to avoid is an instance where if I as an examiner say, give me your system access records, and then that leads to an entity saying, well, we don't have system access records. They might have something that has that same data, but it's called something different, but it's an excuse not to provide it to me, or they don't know. We really want to avoid that. So instead, we kind of grouped supporting documentation into subject areas, and that way it's just more communication between the regulator and the examined entity to avoid those miscommunications. So again, reference point 2 is board communication. That could be several things. It could be a recent presentation to the board by the CIO or the CISO. It could be meeting minutes that prove cybersecurity was discussed at a recent board meeting. We did not want to dictate exactly what you should be looking for, but provide avenues for you to start a discussion with the regulated entity to ensure that you end up with everything you really need to conduct a thorough and complete comprehensive exam. So, to the first sheet of the work program, I mentioned The examination or the IT officer questionnaire answers are in here as well. And I walked you through question 1, which is, does your organization have a CISO or have someone with the dedicated authority for cybersecurity? If their answer is yes, that's awesome. Verify that the person does in fact have that authority. That helps you, scope your exam that way. But if they say no, and they provide the reason why, column F here, or non-core control considerations, provides some options for non-core controls you might want to scope into your exam. ID 5, that first line there, means question number 5 in the Identity tab. PR1, question number 1 in the Protect tab. These are just places for you to start. Take a look at them, see if they're relevant, see if they're going to help you perform a more comprehensive exam based on the entity's responses. And then we have the work program itself. Again, these are, I'll provide the URL in a moment. These are all available online behind our login. I encourage you to spend some time working through it yourself. It's just going to make a lot more sense when you walk through it on your own. But for now, you see there's a work program question in column B, and that's, again, ID 1, ID 2. That's a reference number. Each question in column C is mapped to the document request list. So this means whatever documents are requested in grouping 7 could be relevant to this question. And then column D is where you see if something is a core control or not. It is Excel, so you can just sort it and select, yes, you want only things that are core controls, or select everything, or just if for some reason you just want to take a look at what the non-core controls are, you can sort by N. Then the examination question itself. Response, yes, no, NA. Again, NA is totally fine answer as long as it's justified by the entity or by the examiner. And then this column I is the one I mentioned where it's a translation column. Some are very self-explanatory or should be explanatory. Others really do try to translate the question into layperson language so that it's easier for the entity to understand, and they can understand why they're being asked this question. It helps create a little bit more buy-in into the exam and into the examination results. So this is what the work program looks like. This is the Identify tab. I'll just scroll down slowly so you can see. There are many, many questions in Identify and Protect. Please don't be daunted. They are all there for a reason. We think they're really useful. So it just looks like that. It's a normal Excel sheet, hopefully self-explanatory, and that is the work program. Okay. So now that we have the work program, what are we going to do with it? We originally discussed having this process. We would have a 6-month pilot, which we would roll this out to a limited number of states, examiners, and institutions, let them pilot it. We'd do one big revision and then release it out publicly to everyone. But what we ultimately concluded is that this is really only going to be useful if people are actively using it. And so we're releasing it in an agile process, which means every month we will be looking at the feedback we gather from you, the regulators, as well as any industry that wants to weigh in. And any commonalities, any trends we see, we're going to consider incorporating them into the next iteration of the work program, which will of course be version controlled so that there's no confusion over which version you've sent out or what you're working from. So feedback can be sent to Nonbank Cyber Program at csbs.org. And as I mentioned, at the end of the month, I'll be reviewing that feedback to see if there's anything that we want to consider for inclusion or anything we want to consider stripping from the work program. Please let us know if anything is unnecessary or you just have any changes to suggest, not about word choice or font size or punctuation. We welcome substantive feedback, constructive criticism, and I promise you that it will be looked at and considered because we're really appreciative of your effort. And again, as I say, this is really only as good as it is useful, and we want to make sure that you all feel it reduces your effort and still, makes things more secure. So the work program is available now. It was emailed out by Mike Bray about a month ago, 5 weeks ago perhaps, and it is available at the URL you see in front of you, csbs.org/CSBS Nonbank Cybersecurity Examination Program. It is behind a login. And I believe only CSBS members have login information to access it.
That is correct, but we have a second URL that we can send to non-CSBS member regulators that will allow you access to the program online. So If you're not a direct CSBS member, meaning you do not belong to a banking agency, contact me, ccross@csbs.org, and I will get you the direct URL.
Thank you, Chuck. So again, feedback to Nonbank Cyber Exam Program at csbs.org. Send it anytime throughout the month when it occurs to you, but just once per month at the end of each month I'll be taking a look at it. And that's just an effort to manage the workload. One other resource I'd like to highlight. A couple years ago, CSBS put together a resource guide for bank executives called Cybersecurity 101. And the idea was that it was a little booklet, an online publication that we could hand to industry to help them start to formulate their cybersecurity program. So what does a bank CEO need to know about cybersecurity? Well, that was great a couple years ago, but what we did the past year is revise it, stripped out some unnecessary information, updated a few things, and we retargeted it not just for bank CEOs, but all financial sector executives. So banks, non-banks, anyone with an interest in the topic. And we're really pleased to announce that that is now available at csbs.org/cyber101. You'll find a downloadable PDF there as well as a web version that's easy to click through, sort through. I understand that not all institutions have really well-developed cybersecurity programs, and that could be for one of several understandable reasons. But we recommend that you send them the Cyber 101 booklet as a resource guide. It might help explain or even just get boards, CEOs, any kind of executive thinking about cybersecurity, what they need to do. And it's also a good way for them to prepare for exams because Cyber 101 is modeled after the NIST cybersecurity framework as well. So Cyber 101 is available at that URL. It might be useful for any of you as well looking to just get a better understanding of cybersecurity. So please, make it available if necessary. We, of course, are biased again, but we think it's a pretty good resource for cybersecurity within the financial sector.
And at a minimum, we think examiners should consider downloading this PDF onto their computers. If you don't tend to do a cybersecurity examination, but the entity has interest in cybersecurity, or you'd just like to get more information out there to the entity, your examiners can provide them with this either in printed PDF form or transfer the electronic PDF to them, and they will have quite a bit of information to enhance their programs within their institution.
All right, so we're going to open it up to questions in just a moment, but before I do, I'm going to address some of the questions that pop up time and time again. So the number one question we get is, how long does this exam program take? And in the interest of transparency, I, with about 10 years of experience in cybersecurity exams, could do this in a day, provided I had all the information available to me. I knew who to follow up with. No one was hiding anything. There were no miscommunications. A day. In speaking with some of the examiners, we think probably 5 days is an appropriate estimate. And that doesn't all have to be on site, but 5 days of back and forth, asking questions, reviewing documentation should be sufficient to complete the full work program. That's just an estimate, of course. It will vary based on state resources, prioritization, so on and so forth. But I did want to highlight that before because I assume it would be a question. Something else is, will this be an SES? We hope so. Yes. As of right now, the capability is not there, but we're hoping by mid-2020 to have the exam program in SES. That will help reduce the workload. You can leverage other states' examination processes. So the goal of this work program is to reduce your workload. There's no need for multiple states to be conducting the exact same exam when you trust the work of your brethren. So similarly, another question I've received a couple times is, well, if an entity has just had a third-party audit conducted, do I need to go in and do it all over again? And the answer will depend on commissioner guidelines and your individual state laws, but you should feel free to leverage any existing work that has been done, provided you can verify that that entity had an audit conducted by a legitimate third party. That's great. That's less work for you to do. So from our perspective, you can absolutely leverage any other documentation that has already been verified and inspected. So that's it for me. Hopefully I preempted a few of your questions. But now I'd like to open it up to anything else. And as Chuck said, please identify yourself and your state so that if necessary, we can follow up offline.
All right, seems like we may not have any questions at this time. This is the second training that we've given within the last week. The first training we gave, we maxed out on our 150 telephone lines for the training, so we decided to make this training this week available to examiners. We will also be posting this recorded training session on the website alongside the program, so you can find it there and refresh yourself if you need to. Okay, well, thank you for your time. We look forward to hearing back from you on how the examination program works for you in the field. And Jess, thank you for giving this training, and thank you to our work group members who made all of this possible. Thank you and have a good day.